Good morning. I'm honored to be here with so many incredible champions for LGBTQ plus equality. On behalf of Equality California, I want to thank our amazing Senator Padilla for his longtime leadership in the fight for civil rights and for getting this bill across the finish line. The Respect for Marriage Act is an affirmation that the United States will stand up and protect the freedom for all Americans to marry the person they love. It's a reflection of the fact that for an overwhelming majority of Americans across political parties, backgrounds, and in every corner of the country, the debate for marriage equality is settled. That hasn't always been the case, of course. It was right here at City Hall nearly 19 years ago when our governor, then mayor, began issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples, regardless of the personal and political consequences. The court battle over those marriage licenses ultimately led to a successful lawsuit by Equality California, represented by our friends from Lambda Legal, NCLR, and the ACLU, challenging the state's marriage bans. Though we proved victorious in that fight, we were devastated when just months later, voters approved Prop 8. And while the courts invalidated that ban, the so-called Defense of Marriage Act, and ultimately all marriage bans, we know now from the Dobbs decision and Justice Thomas's own words that this new far-right Supreme Court cannot be trusted to uphold its own precedents or protect our civil rights. In contrast to the court, this week's victory comes at a time when nationwide support for marriage equality is at an all-time high. 71% of all Americans from all walks of life, across demographics, geographies, and party lines agree that loving, committed couples deserve equal rights, equal justice, and to quote a Bergefell decision, that Justice Thomas denied equal dignity under the law. It's a big victory to be celebrated, but it is not a substitute for full lived equality for all LGBTQ plus people, and it will not end discrimination against LGBTQ plus people across the country or the hateful rhetoric from anti-LGBTQ plus politicians and extremists. Less than 2 weeks after the mass shooting at Club Q in Colorado Springs, where 5 people were murdered and dozens more injured, we continue to mourn the lives lost and to support the community that has been shattered. All people deserve to feel safe and respected in the places they call home. So today, we celebrate this bipartisan victory, and we are partners here. Thank you, Senator Padilla and Senator Feinstein, for your colleagues and your leadership. Tomorrow, we fight for a world that is healthy, just, and fully equal for all LGBTQ plus people until the work is done. And next up is a dear friend and colleague who's been leading the fight on so many important LGBTQ plus civil rights, including marriage equality, for nearly 2 decades. Lambda Legal's Chief Legal Officer, Jenny Pizer. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, 31 years ago, 3 loving couples in Hawaii sued for their freedom to marry. Public support nationally at that time was about 20%. Lambda Legal joined them, and things were going well. But in September of 1996, as we presented our expert testimony to the trial court, an overwhelming bipartisan majority in Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act. 3 months later, we won our trial, having shown that nothing about the welfare of children justifies marriage discrimination. Well, over the next decades, scores of lawsuits, hundreds of legislative and ballot fights, and the tireless efforts of thousands upon thousands of community members have transformed public understanding, moving public support from 20% to more than 70% today. The happy, largely unremarkable family lives of married same-sex couples everywhere have shown their neighbors and their coworkers and fellow PTA members the claims of danger to children and to society as a whole if same-sex couples can marry is just untrue. The road that we've all paved together since 1991 has had many steps, from the thrilling San Francisco marriage chapter here in early 2004, the 4 years of state court litigation leading to our Summer of Love, when 18,000 couples married across California in 2008, and then, of course, Prop 8. I'd like to acknowledge here 2 of my very favorite clients ever, Karen Strauss and Ruth Borenstein. They were the lead couple in our state court challenge to Prop 8, and it was their generosity and courage that helped us protect those 18,000 married couples. But as we all know, the California Supreme Court refused to strike down Prop 8 entirely. That took the federal case that Chris Perry will tell you about in a minute. So many more cases then took us to the Obergefell win in the US Supreme Court in 2015, and then more litigation about Social Security benefits and immigration, and the VA benefits are still not finalized. Every step forward has been hard won by group efforts, sharing personal stories, organizing, public education, changing laws, and changing lives by telling the truth. The Respect for Marriage Act, at long last, removes the Defense of Marriage Act and replaces it with affirmative marriage recognition, federally and state to state. It shouldn't be needed, and maybe it won't be. But if the Supreme Court does outrageously erase the constitutional protection for the freedom to marry, this law will mitigate the harms. It doesn't override state laws restricting who can marry in state. Congress doesn't have that power, but it can require all states and local governments to treat all married couples equally. This law also doesn't answer the many hot open questions about religious objections to LGBTQ equality, including in marriage, in the private sector. But the law's bipartisan religious amendments do make explicit some basic safeguards for religious liberty in houses of worship and in organizations formed for religious purposes, not craft stores, Hobby Lobby, not web designers, 303 Creative, or bakers or florists. The Senate rightly rejected amendments designed to allow religion-based discrimination in many private sector institutions, businesses, universities, taxpayer-funded social services. And that matters because discrimination against LGBTQ people in those contexts is a huge problem. That's why we need the Equality Act. We need the Equality Act. That bill is about the public marketplace and public services which must be open to all equally. The Respect for Marriage Act will require government at all levels to honor our marital status, and it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So we celebrate this milestone. It's huge, and it's not enough. We have to keep going, all of us together, making our case for full equality and for secure freedom everywhere. And now it's my immense pleasure to introduce your mayor, Mayor London Breed.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to start with expressing my appreciation and that representation matters. Having our senator, our United States Senator, Alex Padilla, here to highlight this very important legislation that passed in the U.S. Senate and still has a ways to go through the U.S. House of Representatives. But I want to thank him and commend him for his leadership, along with Senator Dianne Feinstein, who introduced the legislation. It's really extraordinary to have people like that who represent San Francisco values at their absolute best. I also want to acknowledge our state senator, Scott Wiener, for his fierce advocacy for the LGBTQ community in Sacramento, and his work continues to be a beacon of hope and a shining example of what we can do when we work together. It's great to also be here with our district attorney. Sorry, Brooke, I had a brain freeze. Our district attorney, Brooke Jenkins, and our supervisor who's joining us, Asha Safai. So many amazing elected leaders who support this community. And why is that important? It's important because when you think back in our not so distant history of this country, not so distant, not just to 20 years ago, but back in 1967, the court case of Loving versus Virginia. The court case involved a couple, an interracial couple, a black woman and a white man who wanted to be married, who got married and basically dealt with a number of legal obstacles because it was illegal in this country for people of different races to marry. Fast forward to just 20 years later, and our previous mayor, Gavin Newsom, had the courage to step up and, despite state law and despite the United States law, issue some of the first licenses to allow same-sex couples to marry in San Francisco. It was a proud moment in our city and our country's history when that occurred. Why is this important? It's important because in other places, there continues to be obstacles. Every place is not like San Francisco. We represent values that others tend to follow, but way after the fact. We need this now. There are too many couples who have not had the privilege and the right that they deserve to be married, and also the benefits and some of the other legal challenges that continue to persist just in case something happens to their partner and their inability to take care of their partners. It is a very, very challenging, complex system, and it is very unfair. Dr. Martin Luther King, who we know everyone quotes oftentimes, is basically pushed forward a number of speeches that talked about fighting against unjust laws and how we as a community have to stand for what is right. And so this legislation, the right to marry, gives anyone, he, she, they, any person in this country who wants to marry someone that they love, they have the right to do so, and they deserve the right to do so. So we're proud here in San Francisco to support this legislation and hoping that there comes a day where it's not needed, where it's just naturally a part of what people, human beings in this country are able to do. Justice delayed is not justice denied. And we will continue to fight and lead those challenges right here in San Francisco. And we are so grateful to our elected leaders on the statewide level and the federal level, especially our U.S. Senator who just was elected for a full 6-year term. So he's going to be spending that time. He's going to spend that time fighting for this city, fighting for this state, and fighting for this country. And so we're honored to have him today. And I want to thank all of you for being here. And I want to introduce a fierce advocate who I just absolutely adore. He is one of the most extraordinary policymakers that I've ever had the privilege to work with. He fights for, yes, the LGBTQ community, but he fights for San Francisco, and he is unapologetic in that fight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome State Senator Scott Wiener.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. You know, I think when we talk about this issue, which has been going on for a long, long, long time, and this is truly historic, it's so important to always remember that this is about real, live human beings and their lives. And I remember back when I was on the Board of Supervisors when the U.S. Supreme Court decision came down right before Pride weekend. And we had marriages here at City Hall all throughout the weekend. And on Pride Sunday, I went inside for a few hours to perform ceremonies. And I still remember a young couple, two young Latino men from Kern County who had driven up for Pride to get married. And it became very, very clear to me as I talked to them, two things: that they were deeply in love with each other, and that getting married was going to allow them to stay together and not be separated. And so it was about real live people whose lives are made better by having a country that recognizes their humanity, that recognizes their existence. And so I am so thrilled that we are at this point today. I'm old enough to remember 1996. It was right after I graduated law school that the Defense of Marriage Act was passed. And what a horrific and depressing time that was for a lot of us. And it wasn't just Republicans, it was Democrats too that were voting for that despicable law. And to fast forward decades later and to have not just a party line vote, but a bipartisan vote in both houses to repeal that disgusting law and to make sure that people's marriages are going to be valid all throughout this country. But it is absolutely the case that we have more work to do. This is a historic win. I want to thank Senator Padilla. I want to thank our president, Joe Biden, the most pro-LGBTQ president in the history of the United States of America, and our speaker, our member of Congress, Nancy Pelosi, for doing this. But we have so much more work to do. We need to get Prop 8 out of our Constitution here in California. We need to get the Equality Act passed. And so this is a big step, and I know there are going to be many more great steps to come. So with that, I now have the honor of bringing up someone who I remember when I believe it was Vice President Harris that performed her wedding ceremony, but the amazing Chris Perry.
Oh, I am incredibly moved by the rapid progress we've made over the past 2 decades and the role California and San Francisco have played in the LGBTQ rights movement and the Respect for Marriage Act. Just 18 years ago, then, Mayor Newsom propelled the rights of same-sex couples forward by authorizing marriages right here at San Francisco City Hall. In fact, Sandy and I, along with our 4 boys, sped across the Bay Bridge from Berkeley to join thousands of other couples who are elated by the prospect of equality. And even though those marriages were nullified later that year, it started a historic chain of lawsuits, rulings, and even a discriminatory ballot measure, Prop 8. In 2009, we brought a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of Prop 8, and after a 3-week trial and 5 years of appeals, Prop 8 was struck down in 2013 by the United States Supreme Court. Honestly, one of the happiest moments of our lives was the day Sandy and I were the first couple to be married in California by our now Vice President, Kamala Harris, for the second time, right here at San Francisco City Hall. And it's really remarkable how quickly we've arrived at this moment, just 9 years later, celebrating a legislative victory by the people, for the people. And despite that historic moment, the advancement and preservation of basic civil rights for all Americans is not done, which is why we need leaders like Mayor Breed, Senator Wiener, and Senator Alex Padilla, who was recently elected for a full term as the first Latino to represent California United States Senate. The son of immigrants, Senator Padilla grew up in the San Fernando Valley and studied mechanical engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Since arriving at the United States Senate, Senator Padilla has been a champion for working class families and a staunch defender of LGBTQ rights. He has introduced legislation to enhance protections for the LGBTQ community to achieve full equality and was proud to cast his vote in favor of the Respect for Marriage Act this week. It's my pleasure to introduce Senator Alex Padilla.
Thank you, Chris, for the kind introduction, and to Mayor Breed for your hospitality here today, for Scott Wiener for his leadership in the state capitol and your many years of friendship and partnership, to Equality California Executive Director Tony Hoang, and to all the local, state, and national leaders that are joined with us here today. It is great to be here in San Francisco. And it is a momentous week, not just for San Francisco, but in American history. As you've heard, we are gathered here today just a couple of days after the United States Senate passed the Respect for Marriage Act, taking the first big step to repealing the Hateful Defense of Marriage Act and codifying protections for same-sex and interracial couples into federal law. That's a big, big deal. And it is not lost on me where we gathered today. In fact, it is very intentional. In a city known for not just tolerance, but love. On the steps of City Hall, where San Franciscans, Californians, and Americans from all over have come to wed the person they love, we remember the long path to progress that it took to get here. We remember the protests and marches on the streets of San Francisco, led by trailblazers like Harvey Milk, calling for equality. We remember the lines that extended out the door and down the block from this very City Hall when then Mayor Gavin Newsom boldly began to issue same-sex marriage licenses. And we remember the infamous Proposition 8, the court battles both in state court here in California and in federal court, and eventually the celebrations after the Supreme Court ruled same-sex marriage the law of the land. Now, just a few minutes ago, I had the honor and the privilege of officiating a vow renewal ceremony for a San Francisco couple, Hoang and Tessa Chavez. Where'd they go? There we go. There's such a beautiful story, and it's because of couples like them all across the country that a bipartisan group of senators came together this week because their right to marry is worth protecting. So this week, yes, the Senate took a bold step to affirm the lives of millions of LGBTQ and interracial couples in America. We sent a clear message that members of the LGBTQ community are worthy of equal treatment under the law, regardless of who you are, who you love, or who you choose to marry. And I'm looking forward to seeing this bill pass the House. We hear that Tuesday will be the vote in the House of Representatives, overseen by none other than San Francisco's own Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and then onto President Biden's desk for signature. But let's also be clear. You've heard this from other speakers. We know that we still have so much more work to do to achieve full equality. The fact that this bill was even necessary, the idea that in the wake of the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, some of our most fundamental rights are being threatened by a radical wing of the Supreme Court means that Congress must act. We still have more to do to protect against states who might try to ban same-sex marriage if Obergefell is overturned. And we have work to do to pass the Equality Act to ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity so that we better protect all LGBTQ Americans. But this week, not only did we expand protections for LGBTQ and interracial couples, we fundamentally pushed our nation one big step closer to a more equal, more compassionate, more perfect United States of America. And in so doing, we're proving that in America, change is possible. Progress is always within reach, and that we're willing to fight for the rights of all Americans, no matter how long it takes. Thank you all again for being here, and we'll open up to a few questions. I imagine we might have answered all of them by now. All right. Well, thank you all very much. You all have a great weekend.